And we need to move on to the next guest who's waiting here next to me. He's with us here physically, and he is from a company called Hexicon. And Hexicon develops floating wind farms and also designs floating multi-turbine wind power platforms. So a warm welcome now to Markus Thor, CEO from this company. Here you go.
Thank you. Am I heard okay? It sounds like it. Very good. Thank you very much for the opportunity to speak here today. I wanted to give a brief introduction to Hexicon as a company, as well as the market and a few of the market drivers that we see really pushing this forward. And by this I mean offshore wind and a part of offshore wind, which is the floating segment, which is not really anything we see or have been built here in Sweden. But from a global perspective, it's definitely something that's really gaining momentum across all parts of the globe. So let me start by briefly putting a bit of history to Hexicon and what we do today. So Hexicon is a company here in Stockholm that was founded in 2009 based on a grand vision that is a floating island, a large-scale floating renewables island with all kind of renewable technologies on it. Wave power, solar, tidal, you name it. And our job, very much encouraged by that vision, is to create something commercially viable out of. And that's had its twists and turns over the years to something that we have today, which is a business model that do two things. So on the one hand, we're a technology provider. We develop floating foundations for offshore wind power in deep water. And on the other hand, we develop projects, likewise for offshore wind in deeper waters. So typically what we see in offshore wind, that is a large industry today, not the least in Europe, that's being built on shallow water. And shallow water is a luxury that we have at scale in the southern North Sea here in Europe. But on a global perspective, waters are too deep to make it economically viable to mount the turbines on the seabed. So in most parts of the globe, as well as in Europe, there's a great need to deploy wind power where waters are deeper, and that means that we need to do it on floating foundations. Hexicon, in essence, with a technology, we develop projects, and we do so in key markets with local partners. We're a fairly slim team here in Stockholm, and a business model where we, through partnerships, both share certain resource burden and financial risk, also bring in investors fairly early in projects that we undertake, and in that way can keep the capital intensity down of Hexicon and thereby scale our business model. And what we're really seeing today is a timing, not only where we are ourselves at Hexicon, where we think that we tried and tested a business model in a few client projects by this time, but also obviously a market that is, to say the least, hot, and some fundamental long-term drivers that are only accelerating this going forward. And let me start there. On a very highest of levels and macro trends really pushing this forward, the renewables industry and not the least offshore wind. Fundamentally, it's about, following the Paris Agreement, I think 2 years ago, the UN came up with a report suggesting that to even have a 50% chance of meeting the Paris Agreement, we need to be climate neutral as a planet by mid-century, so by 2050. And what's happened over the last 2 years is that country after country has adopted their own policies to do so, to reach net zero emissions by 2050. And latest, just before Christmas, giant countries and industries over in the Far East, like Japan, South Korea, and even China, although 10 years later by 2060, have all adopted their own net zero policies. And this is really pushing the industry forward. And it's these set targets on a country-by-country level that then translates into national policies and targets of specific numbers for specific industries and technologies. That's what's gaining the confidence that we really see now, and that is really heating up the market being renewables and not the least offshore wind. And I wanted to give one example of a target that is really mind-blowing and sets a change of scale that has never been seen before in at least in my perspective. And that is when the EU Commission a few months ago came out and said that a target for by 2050, 25% of the energy mix in Europe will be from offshore wind. And that means, in their estimate, a new capacity to be installed of offshore wind by 300 gigawatts by 2050. So that's the equivalent of 300 Swedish-sized nuclear reactors to be installed in 30 years. And this, not only in terms of the investment needed, this is a crucial need. The only way to do it, if we look at the geographies across Europe and what waters represent in terms of depth where the power is needed, a substantial part of this to achieve this needs to be on floating foundations. So encouraged by such targets and policies, Hexicon has carved out a business model that is fairly different, I would say, from a lot of the competition, where we're both a project developer and a technology provider. So what we do is that we focus as a project developer on the early stage developments. So if we look across the globe today, there's a lot of most markets that need offshore wind, have first of all deep waters, as we said, but also there's the policy and the regulations are such that it's through permitting and work that you gain rights to water and rights to produce power offshore. That is in contrast to some markets now more regulated, where there's an auction scheme where you pay a lot of money for your water. So these markets that are unregulated are the ones with local partners that we target and develop project, gain security to seabed, and thereby enhance the value across the project. On the project, the one hand is on the side is the project developments. On the other hand, as a technology provider, it's really about ensuring, and I'll come back showing the technology as well, ensuring that this is cutting edge, protected at all times. And the combined synergies across the two is that it's through projects, there is revenues to be made for Hexicon and the shareholders, of course, on when increasing the value of a project. You can either gain development fees, and we can also maintain certain shareholdings when we invite larger institutions into it. And we have one such example that I'll come back to in South Korea now, that we're working with oil giant Shell on a similar setup, confirming this business model. And on the technology side, when projects are built on our technology, there's the revenue stream that is license fees. So when it's built, a typical percentage of whatever is built within our IP is gained through license fees. And a quick note on the synergies across the two. And as I said, a lot of the competitors to us out in this industry, being floating wind, is either a technology provider or a project developer. And there are good reasons to pick either or, but we see strong synergies across the two. And it might be easier to understand how developing projects enables opportunities to install the technology, but vice versa is also the case. And I'll give you an example. When we set out in early 2018, had identified South Korea as an up-and-coming market. Here is a market where we, with our limited resources, can gain a valuable position. The local partner that we ended up with there specifically was after a European company that had offshore wind experience, but also its own technology. And the reason for it is then to technology transfer that into the local joint venture in Korea and showcase both the company and the technology as a Korean product to be built and create jobs in local shipyards. So we see this in a few different markets now, and we think that that synergy is really the differentiator that supports a position for Hexicon in this gigantic market that is to come. So on the technology side, what we're developing is a floating foundation. So it's basically a large steel structure in a triangular shape that hosts 2 large-scale wind turbines on it. And in one of these corners on this triangle, there's a mooring system connected in a single point, and it's connected through a turret, which is basically a big bearing. So the whole platform is allowed to weather vane when the wind changes direction. Just as you would when you know, at your boat, when you throw in an anchor and you allow that boat to weather vane and to turn with the wind direction. This is the same principle. And what that allows you is that these 2 turbines will not be in front or behind each other in relation to the wind, but they'll be side by side each other, out of the wake of one another. And that is the key enabler to place turbines this close to each other. Traditional wind farms, you separate them by kilometer plus. But here it's possible because these 2 rotate as a pair. And that has certain cost benefits, where it's 1 mooring system, 1 electrical cable, 1 installation, etc. for 2 turbines instead of 1. But what it also does, and this is, I think, perhaps the most interesting part of it, it allows you, because you don't have to separate them as a pair, these 2 turbines, by a great distance. We can, in large-scale wind farm, we can install more power for a given area. Approximately 45% comparing to single turbine alternatives. And that has, translated into direct cost savings on the electrical cable infrastructure within the farm itself. But more importantly, if you look at now where markets are going, and already now in the US, companies, large balance sheets are placing $100 million plus to secure water. A few weeks ago, there was an auction round in England where large oil majors, in this case, like BP and a few others, paid several £100 million to secure water rights. When you spend that kind of money or spend years in permitting, you want to make sure that you get most use out of that water area. So this is important today, but it will only grow over time. I believe that more markets will be regulated in this way, but it's also a fact that as more offshore wind is developed, the areas, the sweet spot areas that are available will become fewer and fewer. And one might look at oceans and think that these are endless, but once you start looking at all stakeholders at sea, that's not the case anymore. So when you exclude an area where the military won't accept you to go, or where there's densely fished areas or commercial shipping, and overlay these on top of each other, the remaining areas aren't that many anymore. So you need to make sure once you've secured an area, you get maximum use out of that area. So where are we and what do we do? Like I said, and I think this is why we've got quite a few markets here now, although several are in quite early stage. The asset-light business model of not holding all the positions in a project, not taking the full fund burden across the project, allows us to scale this with the small team that Hexicon is. So we're 20 people here in Stockholm, but it's sharing and developing this with partners. And I'll give a couple of examples of 2 projects that are up and running. One is in South Korea, which is a fairly densely populated nation, 50 million people in the largest, fairly small area, very mountainous, have since 2017 set out a clear renewable strategy. You need to increase significantly the amount. The only option is to go offshore if you want to do it in large scale, and mainly across their waters, it's fairly deep water. They also realize that there's a lot of coastal activity, not the least fishing. So they're the only country in the world which is paying more for the electricity the farther offshore you are. So with increased distance from shore, you get paid more for your electricity. So this was a sweet spot floating wind market that we started and penetrated in early 2018. And with a local partner managed to, through permitting, gain security to seabed. And in spring 2019, we agreed with oil major Shell to buy into this project. So they're now funding the project and holds a majority of this project that we're now co-developing onwards towards a large-scale wind farm of 1 gigawatt plus over several phases. In Scotland, similar activities, early permitting on our behalf led to Danish Renewables fund Copenhagen Infrastructure Partners to buy into that project, the majority of it, and similarly there we're co-developing it. In both these projects we have a right to a portion of this project, so there's a co-owning and a minority shareholding of Hexicon in these large ventures going forward. A few other earlier stage developments, but I wanted to mention Sweden as well. Like most companies, we've been longing for a home market for years, and we've followed the debate in Sweden for several years. We haven't, however, really dared to press the start button in Sweden until about a year ago, when we started to see the right signals here in Sweden as well. And not the least what happened just only a month ago, where the government proposed a support of the grid connection for offshore wind farms to be cost neutral to onshore wind. And we'll see how that materializes with the Swedish TSO Svenska Kraftnät, who'll regulate that by August this year. But that opens up a new market in Sweden. And the debate that we're seeing now, I think that at least from our perspective and seeing the resource potential of offshore wind, not the least in the southern part of Sweden where it's really needed, this is a country that has, and the whole Baltic Sea for that matter, where there's really good winds. It's fairly deep but suitable water depths for floating wind, but it's also less milder wave climate. So what that gives you is you have that almost the same wind speed as out in North Sea, but lower waves, and it's really a possibility to produce cost-efficient floating units for offshore wind. And you can place them near demand centers and where it's really critically needed, which is mainly in the southern part of Sweden. And I think that it's also encouraged and further push forward, this being our home market in Sweden, by the electrification need. And we heard earlier today a lot of talk about hydrogen, which I think is really interesting, and not the least looking at this is over time, the shifting industry, transport, etc., not the least hybrid and all the steel production going over to being fossil free, and the hydrogen, the green hydrogen need for that. We're going to need renewable power at a really large scale. And I really don't see any scalable alternatives to offshore wind. And speaking of hydrogen, a project not here in Sweden, but in Spain that we're quite excited about, that started about 2 months ago, where we, together with our local partner and large-scale company Acciona, we're developing how our technology fits in a wider technical context. So we're developing an integrated project with both floating wind and floating hydrogen. So we're both integrating hydrogen production into our technology as well as standalone modules. This is a joint industry project over 3 years, supported by the Spanish government. And what's interesting, I think, is that hydrogen really fits well with floating wind. You've got unlimited access to water, but you could also imagine a future scenario where you're not connected to demand centers or specific locations on shore with price demand and whatever you have but you could rather imagine that you offload and onload with shuttle tankers and also provide hydrogen in a future green shipping scenario. So I think there's a lot of exciting potential going forward across hydrogen and floating wind. I think they're looking at time as well, getting some nods here, but just wanted to really quickly, where Hexicon is mentioned, this is my last slide. I think the timing of where we are in terms of a portfolio that is a fairly sizable portfolio, looking at the size of our company, a business model that we now tried and tested, and a market which really is hot now and will only grow as we see it going forward. So our chance or tasks now looking forward is really to enhance this portfolio, both as it stands and with new markets, increase and grow Hexicon in its skill set and resources, and not the least, further optimize and verify all the benefits that we see within our technology, being a multi-turbine floating wind solution. So with that said, thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Marcus, too. I have one question for you. How about competition globally?
Well, this is starting to become quite a bit of competition. Not so much in Sweden, but on a global scale. And the first full-scale floating wind turbine was installed in 2009 by then Statoil, now Equinor. And since then, there's 3 or 4 different installed full-scale versions, but they're at demonstrated prototype stage. So the commercial scale floating wind farms are being planned for now, but they haven't been built yet. The first ones will be built in about 3 or 4 years, and one of them is the one we're developing with Shell in Korea.
Well, best of luck with this very exciting company that you're heading. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.